Hello and welcome. Today we are going to discuss the interest rate swap. So what is interest rate swap and how it works and which scenario we can use it. What is the meaning of interest rate swap and how corporations and individuals can use the interest rate swap for the interest rate income or for the interest income and for the interest payments as well. In this video we are going to discuss both the interest rate income and interest payment as well. So by definition, the interest rate swap is a contractual agreement between two parties to exchange their interest payments. And the most common type of interest rate swap is one in which the party A agrees to make payment to party B based on a fixed interest rate, and the party B agree to make payment to party A based on a floating interest rate, and it is because the first party may expect the interest rate to decrease, and the party B is expecting the interest rate to increase. That's why both of them, the party A and party B, want to tackle their interest rate exposure, and that's why both the parties they enter into a interest rate swap agreement. The floating rate normally is tied to a reference rate, and normally it is the London Interbank Offered Rate, or LIBOR, we can say. The interest rate swap. For example, let's say, assume that Mr. A owns $1 million investment that pays him LIBOR plus 1% every month. As LIBOR goes up, the payment to Mr. A receive changes, which means when the LIBOR goes up, his interest payments will increase, and when the LIBOR goes down, his interest payments will decrease. Now assume that Mr. B owns $1 million, the same amount of investment that pays him 1.5% interest every month. The payment he receives never changes because the interest rate is constant, and there is no concept of LIBOR or any other reference rate here. Mr. A decided that he would rather lock in a constant payment, and Mr. B decided that he would rather take a chance on receiving higher payments. And it is just because Mr. A is expecting the LIBOR to decrease, which will lead to low income of Mr. A, and thus he wants to lock in his income with some constant income or constant rate. And Mr. B is expecting that the interest rate is gonna increase in future, and thus Mr. B is interested in floating or variable interest rate. So Mr. A and Mr. B agree to enter into an interest rate swap contract. Under the term of their contract, Mr. A agrees to pay Mr. B LIBOR plus 1% per month on a $1 million principal amount, called this $1 million principal amount, also called the notional principal or notional amount. Mr. B agreed to pay Mr. A 1.5 per month on the 1 million notional amount. Let's see what this deal looks like under different scenarios. We will discuss two scenarios here. In scenario A, there will be an interest rate. Let's say the LIBOR is equivalent to 0.25% or 25 basis points. And in scenario B, we will change this LIBOR to 1% or 100 basis points. In scenario A, Mr. A received monthly payments of dollar 12,500. This one 12,500, and this is because his interest rate is equivalent to LIBOR plus 1%, and the LIBOR is 0.25% only. So 0.25 plus 1 is equivalent to 1.2%. Sorry. Yeah, yes, 1.2%, and it is equivalent to $12,500 on $1 million. And Mr. B receives a monthly payment of 15,000 from his investment, as his interest rate is fixed, and that is 1.5%. Now, under the terms of the swap contract, Mr. A owes Mr. B $12,500 because they have entered into a contract in which they will exchange their interest payments. So Mr. A is gonna pay $12,500 to Mr. B, and Mr. B is going to make a payment of $15,000 to Mr. A because they have the interest rate swap contract. Therefore, in scenario A, Mr. A is having a benefit of $2,500 because on his own interest rate, which is LIBOR plus 1%, his income would be 12,500. But in this scenario, with the interest rate swap, he is receiving $15,000, and Mr. B, who would have $15,000 with his own fixed 1.5 interest rate, but as he has signed the interest rate swap contract with Mr. B, so he is gonna pay Mr. A 15,000. So in this case, in scenario A, when the LIBOR is equivalent to 0.25%, Mr. A is having 2,500 more than his interest rate, and the interest rate is LIBOR plus 1%. Mr. A is getting benefit, and Mr. B is losing $2,500. Now let's come to the scenario B, in which the LIBOR is equivalent to 1%. Now in scenario B, as we have changed the LIBOR rate, so the income of Mr. A is totally $15,000 under the swap contract, because his interest rate is LIBOR plus 1%, which is equivalent to 20%, let's say $20,000. But under the swap contract, he owes this rate or this amount to Mr. B, so he is gonna pay 20,000 to Mr. B. And in the scenario B, because the interest payment of Mr. B will remain the same because his rate is fixed, and that is 1.5%, so he is gonna pay $15,000 to Mr. A. Under the scenario B, Mr. B is getting benefit of $5,000, and Mr. A is losing $5,000, and it is just because of the interest rate swap contract. So the question here is that why the two parties, are Mr. A and Mr. B, enter into this contract? The answer is Mr. A was expecting that the interest rate will go down and his interest income will decrease. That's why he wanted to tackle this exposure, and to avoid this risk, he exchanged his LIBOR plus 1% interest with with the interest rate of Mr. B, that is 1.5%, and Mr. B, who was expecting that the interest rate would increase, which can lead to higher income for Mr. B, he has exchanged his fixed income with Mr. A. Note that here one thing we should note here is that the interest rate swap has allowed Mr. A to guarantee himself a 15,000 payout. If LIBOR is low, Mr. B will owe him under the swaps, but if LIBOR is higher, he would owe Mr. B money. Either way, he has locked in a 1.5 monthly return on his investment. Mr. B has exposed himself to variation in his monthly returns. Under scenario A, he made 1.25% after paying Mr. A $2,500. But under scenario B, he made 2% after Mr. A paid him an additional $5,000. Mr. A was able to transfer the risk of interest rate fluctuation to Mr. B, who agreed to assume that risk for the potential higher returns. One more thing to note is that an interest rate swaps, the parties never exchange the principal amount. On the payment date, it is only the difference between the fixed and variable interest amount that is paid. There is no exchange of the full interest amount. Interest rate swaps provide a way for businesses to hedge their exposure to change in interest rate. If a company believes long-term interest rates are likely to rise, it can hedge its exposure to interest rate changes by changing its floating rate payment for fixed rate payments. So it was a bit about the interest rate swap contracts, and it was about the investment in which we have interest income. In my next upcoming video, I will talk about the interest rate swap again, but in that video I will give you an example where we borrow money and we have interest expense, not the interest income, but the interest expense, and how we use the interest rate swap contract there we will see in the next video. Thank you for watching. Thanks a lot. If you like the video, please share, comments, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.